you who don't know, I'm Grace Weeks. I'm the president of Students for Education on Neurodiversity, also known as SEND. It's a lot easier to say. Yeah, so welcome to this event, a panel on neurodiversity and the Enneagram and how they intersect and how we can learn more about each other through these ways. Yeah, today with us we have Sarah Duet and Drew Moser, both experts in the fields who are here to tell us a little bit about what they know and answer some questions that were sent in to us. And then at the end, we're going to have some time for the audience to ask questions that they come up with as we go. So if you hear anything that sparks your interest or think of a question you have while they're talking, feel free to write it down and there'll be time to ask that at the end. First things first, I'm going to open us up with a word of prayer because I think that's a good way to open things in general. So, dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day, and thank you that we can still be relatively together in this strange electronic environment. Thank you for the ways that we can come together in this strange time that's come upon us. We ask that your hand of blessing will be upon us throughout this meeting, that all our speakers will have the words to say, and that this will spark excellent conversation and ideas within each other. So thank you for this day and guide us in our interactions. Amen. So with that, would the panelists like to do a brief introduction for themselves before we start into the questions?
Sure thing. Thanks. So like she said, my name is Sarah, and it's Duet because it's French, but I don't correct people like north of mid-Louisiana. So whatever you would like to say is fine. I am an artist, communicator, Enneagram teacher here in Shreveport, Louisiana. So, which is almost Texas, but I grew up south of New Orleans. So, Louisiana girl entirely. I am an Enneagram 4 with a 5 wing, and in light of our neurodiversity conversation, I am an HSP, or highly sensitive person, and also deal with clinical depression and anxiety. So that's just some identifiers up front. And I make a lot of things and share them, but the common thread there is I'm very interested in who we are as humans and how we're connected and why that matters. And so anything I work on I filter through that lens. And I learned about the Enneagram about 10 years ago in a college Christian Leadership Center retreat, actually, and was just immediately obsessed. And we can talk more about the journey with the Enneagram, hopefully through our conversations. But I immediately read everything I could find, listened to things, eventually studied in person quite a bit, and still do with Suzanne Stabile. I am currently in the process of being certified as an Enneagram teacher in the narrative tradition, but have also learned from and studied from a lot of other teachers as well. So I will leave it at that for now and turn it over to Drew.
Well, yeah, thank you all. Thank you for the invitation. Honored to be here with you all, and sad that we weren't able to do this in person on campus, but it looks like a benefit is Sarah gets to join us, so that's fun. And unless you were planning on traveling to Upland for this back in March, probably not. But my name is Drew Moser. I'm Dean of Student Engagement at Taylor and teach in the MAHI program. For those of you not from Taylor, that's a Master of Arts in Higher Education and Student Development program. And so I'm broadcasting to you from the booming metropolis of Upland, Indiana, which some of you are also from Upland, yeah. And those of you, I look forward to having you back in Upland very soon, right, Dan and Charity? We miss you all dearly. So I'm here because I, like Sarah, I've done a lot of work and training with the Enneagram. It's a major part of what I enjoy doing and how I help make sense of relationships in my own kind of interior landscape and my own kind of spiritual development as a Christian. So it's been a formative part of my life for the past 12 years. Was introduced to it when I was working with a nonprofit in Vancouver, British Columbia. It was part of a staff development exercise that I went in classically really skeptical, thinking it's just another one of those things, that those forced family fun activities, right, that we have to do in order to grow as a team and bond. And then came out of it pretty much blown away because it very accurately identified me as an Enneagram type 3 dominant. And so that has been so helpful for me to once I got over the shock that it felt like someone had been reading my mail for a very long time, then realizing, okay, this is really helpful knowledge for me to help me know how to grow and develop and just better understand who I am and kind of what makes me tick. So I have to say though too, I'm here as a beloved friend and colleague, I hope, of Taylor, and someone who knows a bit about the Enneagram. I don't claim expertise in neurodiversity. I look forward to learning from you all as we engage in this conversation. So my comments will be far more focused on what I know about the Enneagram and maybe how the Enneagram helps us better understand what's going on inside of ourselves, especially in our brains. And then hopefully from that, you all who know far more about this than I do can maybe draw some conclusions or connect some dots. Oh, and I should say my wife and 5 kids are outside, and if they could come charging in and you may hear lots of noise, I'll this is just the state of my life right now, is a lot of noise and a lot of people around me. But
Thank you both for that. So now that we know both of you a little bit better, let's jump in. We can ease in with, in a few sentences, how would you describe the Enneagram and what drew you into it? I know you've both touched on that a little bit, but for those who may not be as aware of what the actual definition is.
Sure. I have often found myself in work that requires elevator pitches, and I hate elevator pitches. I usually say, if something's worth talking about, it probably can't be reduced into that short of a speech, unless like the elevator got stuck and broke or something. But the best I can do for a brief description of the Enneagram is just talking about the Enneagram as a personality typing system that combines modern psychology with spiritual and somatic wisdom to describe 9 distinct dynamic ways of being in the world. And those types are based on habitual patterned responses that develop from unique motivations that we each have. And those motivations largely arise from how we think and feel and behave. And that kind of nods to those 3 centers of intelligence that we talk about with the Enneagram. So that is my brief go at it. Do you want to jump in with yours, Drew, or do you want me to continue with how I got interested in that?
Oh, I'd be happy, to jump in. I think that was a great description. I would just say a few other things, just to build upon what Sarah said. That there is a simplicity to this framework of 9 things. Again, this is what Enneagram means. It's a Latin kind of mashup of a figure of 9. So in a really technical sense, there is no such thing as the Enneagram, right? There are many, in fact, perhaps infinite different Enneagrams. Just it's a framework of organizing 9 types of things. Now, the way in which we use it most prominently now, especially in this modern context, is for this psycho-spiritual kind of personality typing system. And I think what's so unique about it, and what Sarah definitely touched on, was that it's kind of the thing behind the thing behind the thing. So a lot of typologies will focus on maybe behavior or even cognition, whereas the Enneagram really tries to get beneath that. So in some ways, it's very simple. it's just a way of categorizing 9 things. But then in a whole other way, it's beautifully complex, that there are, because there's so much beneath the surface in all of us, right? And so our type is just kind of the trailhead to that. And so in that way, I think it's there's always more to learn, about ourselves, obviously, apart from the Enneagram, but the Enneagram helps. And there's always more to learn about the Enneagram as a system itself.
Yeah, right on, all of that. And I think that focus on motivation rather than behavior is what makes the Enneagram unique in the realm of personality typologies, because there are a lot that are helpful in their context, but knowing not just what we do, but why we do what we do, we can really do a lot with that. And so, I mentioned that I got interested in it at a college retreat about 11 years ago, I think. And it was a Christian Leadership Center retreat, and I just was immediately taken with this. It just, as a young introverted 4 in a Christian music band, actually at the time, with 8 other people who were traveling in one vehicle and mostly living together. We needed tools, to help manage all of those early 20-something personalities in tight spaces. And it just was clear to me automatically what a useful tool it could be. And it was, as I kind of reflected on this before our meeting, because I just love both the Enneagram and the model of neurodiversity. And I realized that I kind of was introduced to them at the same time. So alongside an introduction to the Enneagram, I was also discovering autism and Asperger's and this highly sensitive person's research and some other things. So it's hard for me to see them as separate. I've kind of always thought about some of these overlaps, and of course there's not a lot of information out there about that, but it just seemed to me that this is all interconnected. But we are talking about intersections of 2 endlessly complex things, and so I am immensely interested in this conversation and hope I can answer some questions, but I certainly have more questions than I have answers about these intersections. But I do think they're extremely valuable conversations that we need to be having. So from that college experience, I helped found an intentional community house in a neighborhood behind our college here, and we ran that for about 6 years. So I was a resident there for quite a while, and then an intern director, and worked with college and young adult interns. And we used the Enneagram so much in relationship, conflict management, vocational discernment. And that was where I really learned the most. I think you learn this best in or often in community, with people to mirror yourself back to you accurately, and for you to be that mirror for others. So many of my stories and teaching tools came from that time, and it's just grown little by little. That was the first context that I taught in, and have taught in churches and nonprofits and corporate settings and smaller groups and things over the last handful of years. So that gets us mostly to the present. I'm just glad to be with y'all tonight.
So I can share a bit of my, what seemed to be now this whole category of Enneagram origin stories, right? So I mentioned, about 12 years ago, was introduced to this in Vancouver, and have been using it on and off, but fairly consistently in my work, which has always been centered around 20-somethings and college students, which, as you know, anytime we spend time with college students and 20-somethings, some big questions get raised that are really important and worth spending some time considering and pondering. And kept finding the Enneagram to be really helpful. And about 4 or 5 years ago, realized I wanted to dig quite a bit deeper than the knowledge I had. I had done some reading, but really wanted to do some intensive study. So went down and spent a weekend with Suzanne Stabile down at her center in Dallas, and then spent some time studying more individually with Chris Heuertz, who wrote The Sacred Enneagram, if you're familiar with that book. And then did a certification training through a couple of teachers who are in the Enneagram Institute, which is kind of another school in the Enneagram world in Atlanta, Georgia, Nan Henson and Linda Roberts. So, I spent a lot of time doing it. I've got a book that I've been working on for the past year that's coming out soon, podcast that we're working on with a few friends. And so I spent a lot of time kind of immersed in these conversations because I enjoy it so much.
Thank you both for sharing. So with that, I believe we'll get into our first big question, so to speak. Starting off sort of vague with the interaction between Enneagram and neurodiversity in general. Is there any relation, and can one's neurotype affect their Enneagram type or vice versa?
We're gonna go back and forth.
I could, if you want to switch it up, I can go first. I just have some general comments, and then I'm sure sounds like you could probably go a little more detailed than at least I imagine. I think that the very short and simple answer to the question is I'm sure it affects Enneagram type, because we're whole people, and we are life doesn't really work in these compartmentalized boxes where, if this is part of who we are, then that affects our type, whatever that type is. So I definitely believe that there's an impact, or there's some overlap there, or at least a relation. I don't know that I'd be able to speak a lot more specifically than that, but we are, not only are we infinitely complex beings, but those complexities are intertwined and overlapping. And so I think if these are kind of critical aspects of who we are, whether it's neurotype or Enneagram type, then I think that's there's a relationship there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the short answer to the question or cluster of questions that you asked there is just yes and yes. It's all interrelated, and the more we know about the brain and the body, and we just know how interconnected everything is, and how every part of us affects every other part of us, and so I don't think that you can separate the Enneagram type from neurotype. And there are a lot of questions left to answer about how we develop our Enneagram type. Most teachers that I have studied with have landed on type is pretty much inborn. Of course, nature nurture is always the question, and both have an influence. But in terms of the core type that we identify with, or the dominant type we identify with, at least a lot of that is inborn. And so there are actual brain structure aspects of that, and brain function aspects of that. And so, yeah, I think that they're entirely interconnected. I think that our neurotype can influence how our Enneagram type is presented, like how we present, and vice versa to an extent. And I certainly think, I don't know in the broadest sense, but I certainly have friends and family that anecdotally show me that, for instance, like being on the autism spectrum would potentially kind of complicate the typing process for figuring out exactly where you land on the Enneagram, because we've got some stereotypical ideas of both different Enneagram types and autism, and sometimes it can just make that process a little more complicated or take a little more time to figure out where one lands. But I think the value of this intersection and why this makes so much sense to explore is just, if the Enneagram at the simplest level is this description of 9 ways of seeing the world, which of course are influenced by our brain structure and chemistry, it shows us that, you know, to see anything holistically, like if we think 3-dimensionally, we've got this 360-degree circle, and if you imagine you standing on your number, so you know, I'm standing on 0.4, Drew's standing on 3, and we've got people across from us on 0.8, 0.9. If we're all looking literally at something in the middle of that circle, then we're seeing very clearly like 40 degrees of that circle, or of the object in the middle of the circle. And we need everyone else's viewpoint to get a whole picture of what we're actually looking at. And so it can teach us to value those different perspectives, to ask better questions of each other, rather than when there's disagreement or when we're seeing something differently, rather than jumping to like, well, you're wrong or you're crazy. We can say, well, what are you seeing that I'm not seeing? And I think that that very naturally expands into this model of neurodiversity, where we're valuing the neurological differences and the different gifts and challenges, but the different perspectives that those offer, and trying to invite all of those voices and all of those perspectives to the table. So to me, it perfectly, these can work perfectly in tandem. There's just a whole lot to explore about exactly how.
Yeah, that's really well put, Sarah. And it reminds me of a few things that we talk about in the Enneagram community that I'm sure you hear as well, is that there's a difference between type and stereotype. And too often, this is why most Enneagram teachers will really discourage people from trying to type other people unless it's in a really safe and kind of understood and well-trained and just well thought out setting, like a typing interview by a well-trained teacher. Because if I'm just, you know, typing people on the surface or without, you know, a lot of good deep work, I'm only responding to behaviors or stereotypes or biases that aren't helpful. And so I think that's really critical, just given what, you know, I know and understand to be stereotypes, you know, within the neurodiverse community, and that exist, either whether it's in media or, you know, other things. Those can inform these conversations if we're not careful. Also, I think another really core tenet of the Enneagram is that there's no one dominant type or core type that's better than any other type. And I think that that's an important lesson that we can carry to some other, you know, things as we look at, like you said, Sarah, like the gifts of neurodiversity. I think we may be prone culturally to maybe adopt a different approach, as opposed to maybe what could be helpful from the Enneagram, which is, hey, all these types have different strengths and weaknesses and challenges and hurdles and invitations and opportunity.
That's like what I was saying. Thank you for those answers. That was very, yeah, it was a very good answer. I'm going to go with that. So with that, we're saying that there is a relationship between our neurotype and our Enneagram type, because both are very whole person entities. So with that brings us to some specific questions that were sent in to us. Are there other neurotypes that are more likely to be certain Enneagram types? For instance, 6s are often called the anxious types. So are they more likely to have anxiety? And if so, would treatment for anxiety, like therapy or medication, change one's outlook, and would that change in outlook change their type?
Good question. In short, to the first question, I don't know, because while anxiety is a core issue for 6 and that whole head triad, the 5, 6, and 7, any type can experience anxiety or have anxiety disorders even. Why one is anxious is really the question in relation to the Enneagram type. And so that that's important to acknowledge. Again, we're getting to behavior or even symptom versus motivation or the reason why one is experiencing anxiety. I think theoretically, though, yes, perhaps more sixes would be identified as anxious or have anxiety diagnoses, but I don't have any data to prove that. So I feel like I have to say I don't know, but there are potential correlations there. But in trying to avoid those stereotypes that we're talking about, it's important to not just think, oh, this person has anxiety, they're a 6, or this person is depressed, so they're a 4, or vice versa. So possibly, but I don't know.
Yeah, I agree, Sarah. I refer to anxiety as it relates to the Enneagram as an equal opportunity offender in many ways. Like, I think part of the human experience is how we deal with and manage and respond to anxiety. So now it gets to a whole different thing when we're talking about anxiety disorders or something that's, more clinically diagnosed. So I actually think we could go around the horn and talk about how each type responds to or kind of engages anxiety. I do think 6s just may be a little bit more, they're stereotyped or pigeonholed with being the most anxious. They also just might be a little bit more honest and transparent about their anxiety that they're feeling, whereas other types have figured out how to cover it up a little bit more. I'm not sure. But yeah, I agree with Sarah. I think it's really difficult to know how this conversation intersects with, certain types over the others. I'm sure there are stereotypes that are out there regarding the intersections of neurodiversity and Enneagram type, but I imagine that the logic of the Enneagram applies also to this conversation, that just they're all, you can be a neurodiverse individual in any dominant personality type would be my suspicion, at least.
Yeah, and I mean, you asked a second question, and I will get to that shortly because that's important. There is some research, really a good bit of research actually, through the Enneagram Institute, the school that Drew mentioned studying with, on like potential pathologies for each type and potential clinical diagnoses for each type. And again, it's not a one-to-one or an exact science, it's just potential. And even then, it's still a conversation largely around pathology, which is not necessarily a conversation about neurodiversity, but there are some patterns there. And some, I have had a teacher explain that that the Enneagram types themselves are, to an extent, like a subclinical version of some clinical diagnoses. And I don't know entirely how I feel about that, but like, for instance, it's actually Suzanne Stabile that talks about like potential misdiagnoses of children with illnesses or conditions when it's really just their Enneagram type. So like a type 1 child might get diagnosed with OCD, but it may or may not be really at a clinical level, or 4s with depression or bipolar, and 5s, especially introverted 5s, with Asperger's or autism, 7s ADHD, 8s oppositional defiant, 9s ADD. So there are some patterns there to be drawn for sure. I don't know of anyone who has good data on that, and so that is what I would love to start collecting, is some of these measures with Enneagram and some neurodiversity markers and diagnoses. But you asked about therapy and how that would affect one's Enneagram type. Is that right? So I don't think that therapy or doing doing personal work and working with diagnoses would necessarily change your Enneagram type. I am from schools that teach that core type does not change. But I think certainly and I've experienced this certainly with working with the Enneagram and being in therapy and all of the things for so many years, that there's certainly a loosening of the type structure, you know, because the Enneagram type is something we kind of put on to defend ourselves or to help manage ourselves or make our way in the world. And what can really come from Enneagram work is like is loosening the grip on that, kind of allowing some of that scaffolding to fall away when it's safe to do that. And so I think there certainly can be a loosening of that type structure and the limitations that we have experienced within that. And it can be changes in levels of health. Again, Enneagram Institute has really good work on these kind of 9 levels of health for each type, and just one's experience of oneself can change significantly with that work. But the type patterns in my experience still do continue to show up. It would just be in different and maybe more manageable ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's, again, well said, Sarah. I think that there is, there's a danger when we talk any sort of personality typing system or typology to think of it as fixed, right? That once we discover our type, that's just who we are. And then it becomes either a crutch or a weapon or something like that. When in fact, I think I mentioned before that the type is really the beginning or the trailhead, because, I've heard it said, I didn't come up with this, but that Enneagram type is really the box that you're in, because personality, and we all know our personality gets us through life, but not always swimmingly, right? I mean, it's how we've learned to kind of manage the world and present ourselves in the world, but and sometimes it works really well for us and sometimes it just doesn't, right? And so that loosening that Sarah's talking about in many ways is learning how to either recognize the box that we might be in, or perhaps even to some degree climb out of it. And I agree with Sarah, not to the extent that our type changes. I don't also think, I agree with Sarah that our dominant type kind of remains the same throughout the balance of our lives, but it can help us, find a little more freedom within and around our personality type. And therapy can help with that. In fact, there's a really interesting resource that I came across in my training in Atlanta called the Enneagram Field Guide, which is a therapist that really talks about how each type approaches therapeutic environments, or why they go to therapy, what tends to work for that type in therapy, what tends to not work for that type in therapy. And then she flips the script, and if people want to be a therapist, how your type helps and hinders you as a therapist. Again, just a resource that I think can be helpful as people try to seek some help as they learn to kind of unpack these things and grow and change.
I just wrote that down. I hadn't heard of that one. Thank you.
Yes, it's lesser known, but it's really, really helpful and small. It's just a field guide, so it's really helpful.
That's awesome. And I will just to be fair to another viewpoint on this, I am new to his work, but Dr. Jerome Leba has a new book out called The Brain-Based Enneagram. Hey, look at that. We got a visual. Perfect. I have pre-ordered mine, but it has not come in because it's the new version. But he's been recommended to me by multiple people. I have flipped through that book in person, but just sat down with a podcast the other day and like really got a full picture of his viewpoint, I think. And he talks about not necessarily just having this one core type, but the efficiencies, the levels of efficiency we have in all of the types and kind of how that's stacked. And I do think to some degree, all types are present. I mean, like we have been saying, like we're whole persons, and if the Enneagram is a picture of the whole human personality, then at least a bit of all of that is in all of us, though we do develop this one dominant strategy. And so I think the most helpful and the most adaptive work that we can do is with that dominant strategy. But part of what accounts for our differences and the varieties in all of these types may be this stacking, this level of efficiency that we have in the various numbers, if that makes sense. So that's just an additional resource that we have links to now. Thank you, Drew. Or I guess that's the field guide.
Yeah. I also tried to put Jerome's in too. So Jerome and I studied together in Atlanta, and yeah, he's a functional neurologist. So I brought that book back from my office because I wanted to make sure and recommend it, because he is one of the kind of most interesting thinkers on the brain and the Enneagram. And so, and I'm sure we could get him in with this group in some way, shape or form, to share his work. He's really kind and brilliant guy to talk about these things. So, and I think he'd have a lot to add to this conversation.
Oh, thank you both for sharing. That was very informative. Next question is sort of similar to the previous one, jumping off. I know Sarah mentioned this a little bit, that type 5s can tend to be stereotyped as stereotyped with along the autism spectrum. So next question is, some characteristics of the autism spectrum align with certain traits of Enneagram numbers, specifically 4s and 5s. Is this a real trend or just coincidence? But specifically, does gender tend to play a role? As in male and females on the autism spectrum tend to present differently. Would that affect, basically?
Yeah, that question gets me really excited. So I think that there are real trends. Again, I need data to prove that. So hold that loosely. But theoretically, yes, I think there are trends. And I have started in some kind of initial research and work that Dan and I have been talking about. I have started trying to compile, potential autism traits that are kind of in the terrain of each Enneagram type. I'm not happy enough with that list to share it fully publicly yet, because I'm pulling from a few resources, and to me, it still feels not as positive as it should be. And so I need some real time to sit down with that list and do some work on it myself. But in pulling from other sources and just kind of a first glance and first go at it from me, I think that what I have kind of tallied is that there are this is how they would rank. Let's do it that way. So I think 5 and 4 are kind of tied for the maybe the most possible autism traits, with 9 being a very close second to that. And that makes sense if we think about stances, that 4, 5, 9 withdrawing stance. And so there is a turn inward in stress, or just the social style of withdrawing to manage oneself. So 4s, 5s, and 9s. 1s would follow, and 6s would follow the 1s. And then I think 7 and 8 kind of tie for possible traits, and then 3s, and then finally 2s. And so I think that, at least in the addition or the initial theoretical and just kind of research work that I've been able to do, I think that's how they stack. Of course, I'm very open to other ideas or perspectives on that, and again, have more work to do. But the gender question is particularly interesting to me. And so I mentioned earlier, that I kind of found the Enneagram alongside autism, and specifically at the time Asperger's, because that was still in the DSM. But I found this together because I thought I was on the spectrum, and I still can't tell you 100% whether I am or not. I certainly can't claim that, but I thought that I might be, and that was where all of that research began. And as some of you might know, it's complicated, because it's very male biased, all of that testing and all of that research. So at the time, that didn't seem like the case, but through the Enneagram and experiencing extreme stress as a 4 and being kind of in that 2 space, the stress number, and then I'm like off the charts HSP. And so the combination of all of that and the tools around that was kind of was satisfying for what I needed at the time. And so I kind of worked with that and moved on. But years later, figured out that a number of my favorite people and people that I have gotten along with the best were on the spectrum, and kind of turned back to that research in the last 5 years or so. But what I have found most helpful recently is the work of an autism researcher named Sarah Hendricks. That's Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, Hendricks, H-E-N-D-R-I-C-K-X. There's an X on the end of it. And she has developed this whole model addressing this question of gender, of not simply a male version of autism and a female version of autism. That can be the shorthand for it, but she calls it autism 0 and autism 1. So that binary kind of zeros and ones language. And the very oversimplified way of describing that is autism 0 is kind of what we more stereotypically think of as kind of the Rain Man idea and the like science savant kind of image that conjures. And then autism 1, which would be the more feminine, but not only in girls and women, the more kind of artistic, and one not as verbal or delayed verbal, and one highly verbal and early verbal. And and she's done so much research and sketching out in all of the various diagnostic criteria for autism, kind of both of these versions. And I think that addresses this misconception that like there's a lack of empathy in autistic people, when there can be hypo or hyper empathy, and kind of delineates that distinction across the board. And so that's a very specific look at the gender question. I'm sure we can expand that into other neurotypes, but that is kind of what has been really compelling to me. And then while we're recommending books, if you haven't heard of Camouflage, has anyone heard of this? It's The Hidden Lives of Autistic Women. It's written as a graphic. It's not a novel. It's a scientific thing, but it's written graphically and is beautiful, and is a recent release, and is starting to try to create some resources and challenge those male bias stereotypes.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Sarah. And I look forward to seeing you when that work is ready to go more live. If you were to force me to do that ranking, which would have been, I would have been hesitant to do, but that's how I would have ranked based on what I know. So it makes sense to me, that ranking of the 9 types in that way. There's another layer to this, is then when we start to look at Enneagram type, then there's all sorts of other kind of gender-based concerns that we have to deal with that are culturally laden. So when we get to type, it can be tough in some cultural settings for female 8s, for instance. And so it's just another layer of complexity, because they're considered bossy as opposed to having leadership skills, or even worse, they're given worse maybe labels. That would be one example. And that can be true for a lot of the types, that they're more maybe stereotypically male in this culture, or stereotypically female in this culture. And that can kind of cause some confusion and frustration.
Thank you both for sharing. That was really interesting. I'm glad to see you had a lot more to add on to that than since it was such a similar to the first question, but you had a lot to add on to that. I appreciate that. So onto a slightly different subject. Our next question is, how can the Enneagram be a helpful perspective for people that struggle with mood disorders?
Well, as a person with a mood disorder, with depression, I have found it to be extremely helpful. I think it was through reading some of Dan's blogs, came across Thomas Armstrong and got this Power of Neurodiversity book. I'm sorry, we're just throwing all the books at you, but I live with my books. They're all over the desk. And while I think that the chapter on autism is actually a little dated and there are some problematic things in it, the chapter on mood disorders made me like really proud and glad to have a mood disorder. So there is some really good stuff in there. But I think at the simplest level, just this awareness of our patterns is the starting point and is maybe the most valuable thing. And so to be able to start knowing what to look for, to know that, you know, when I start when I'm on a walk around the neighborhood, which I make sure to take every day, because now I know I get caught in this like feeling, thinking loop. And if I don't move my body and like remember that it's there, things get bad quick. And so I'm on this walk, but if I'm starting to, you know, we're in a new house, it's wonderful, it's beautiful, it's, you know, it's somewhat custom. But if I'm walking around the neighborhood and am like looking at like, oh, but look at that, I wish we had that, and like, oh, I wish, like I'm starting to envy all of these other houses that I don't actually have any, you know, like I can go, okay, this is the pattern. What is it that's really going on that is igniting this envy impulse in literally everything that I'm looking at? Then I can kind of have an intervention with myself earlier, rather than years ago just letting that go and go and go until there's a real episode of something. And so I think that's key. That's number one. These levels of health that I described, kind of reading through those, being able to identify kind of where we are, where I am, and kind of knowing the red flags to look for when I start idealizing everything and then reality is disappointing all of the time. What's really going on there? What really needs to be addressed? And so the awareness, and then having and developing the practical strategies and tools to use to manage mood. Because mood is not actually an indicator of like levels of health or anything. And if you have a mood disorder, you know, that can fluctuate and be all over the place. But if you know what to look for, can identify those things, and then know how to intervene. And again, that awareness of the body that I have, that the Enneagram has helped me develop more fully. And I have some other chronic illness stuff that has kind of forced that on me. I realized that a lot of what activated mood problems, like in high school, now that I know how to more specifically identify things, like I think sometimes when I really was in a bad place, I was maybe hungry and thirsty and or had to, you know, like I am identifying these I have identified these very basic like physical needs that can turn into other things, and can just manage all of that much more efficiently as an adult and after a lot of this Enneagram work.
Yeah, and you know, a few times we mentioned you know, different triadic groupings of the Enneagram, which I think is really it's the building block structure of the whole framework. And whether it's with, you know, with a mood disorder, or I'm going to put a link to the levels of development that Sarah mentioned. And I don't want to conflate mood disorder with levels of development, like Sarah said, so please don't hear me say that. But since it was mentioned, you know, each type, according to this Rizzo-Hudson model, has 9 different levels of development, you know, in 3 zones. So that kind of top zone would be healthy, that middle zone would be average, and then that bottom zone would be unhealthy. And at the very bottom of that bottom zone is where we get into pathology. But I think generally the Enneagram can help. Once you know your type and start to live with it, with that knowledge for a little while, you can start to recognize some of these healthier moments, unhealthier moments, some more of the average tendencies that can be really helpful. And then these triadic groupings are also are really important and core to the Enneagram. So these triads, you know, the 8, 9, and 1, they're in the gut triad. The 2, 3, and 4 are in the heart triad. And then the 5, 6, and 7 are in the head triad. And so this means that this is the center of intelligence that they tend to lead with, right? Which can be really helpful because just because we lead with that center intelligence doesn't always mean that we use it correctly. And sometimes we lead with it and over-rely on it. And this is where we get to those stances that Sarah mentioned. The 4s, 5s, and 9s form a different triadic grouping. The 1s, 2s, and 6s form a different triadic grouping. And then the 3s, 7s, and 8s. And those are grouped in the stances by the very center of intelligence that you tend to repress or misuse. And so when we're talking about struggles of any kind, whether it be perhaps with mood disorders or something else, I think that knowledge can be really helpful because then we can start to learn how to more regulate ourselves and integrate our heads, our hearts, and our bodies in ways that help us be more present to the moment and can recognize some patterns, like Sarah said, before we spiral downward. And that can be really helpful knowledge that is for any Enneagram type.
Yeah. That was very insightful. Okay, so this is the last real question that we have laid out from beforehand is, how can the Enneagram be helpful in maintaining strong mental health? Which you touched on a little bit with the previous question, but also relates into caring well for others who struggle with mental illnesses. So not only can it help ourselves with mental health, but also how can we use it to help others who we know?
Yeah, well, I do think, and we've touched on this, but mental health is, it's a holistic enterprise, right? So it really requires us to tend to our bodies, to tend to our hearts, and to tend to our brains to the best that we can. And that's not to say that if we know the Enneagram really well, then we will never suffer, from mental illness, or our mental health will never be, struggling or any of those things. But I do think it gives us some tools. Each type, when we know these things about our type, it can give us some tools and resources to help us make sure, because there are certain types that just really struggle to be in their bodies. And there are certain types that really struggle to connect with their hearts. And there are certain types that really struggle to access the intelligence that they have, the IQ that they have in their brains. And so that language can be really helpful. And it can also, I think, help us be compassionate towards ourselves when we're not doing so well, right? Because we understand ourselves better and we're a little bit more aware of what's going on underneath the surface. And then once we do that, then we can be, I also think, more compassionate towards others in some really profound ways. Instead of maybe being initially annoyed or frustrated or just confused or exasperated with others when they're struggling, or when we don't quite understand what they're going through. I think we realize, this truism that seems to get attributed to everyone, that, be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a great battle, right? And I think the Enneagram should give us, a knowledge of it should give us compassion towards others and empathy towards others, as opposed to, another weapon in our arsenal, or another kind of sarcastic joke or crack that we can make towards other people.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. And I think anything I would have to say about maintaining personal mental health in general kind of ditto to what I said to the previous question, but caring well for others who are struggling. I think I have just found myself using this language so much, and again, it came from reading Dan's blogs, but the being able to meet each other in the middle. And so having this language with which to tell our own stories and to hear the stories of others and to translate those for each other, and just having awareness of what life is like as these different types, both Enneagram types and neurotypes, and being able to use that knowledge and awareness to kind of meet in the middle it's not that any one of us always has to completely cater to or change or adjust, but if we all have a little more knowledge and awareness on board, then we can all make some of those that compassionate movement that Drew was saying, you know, this we can meet in the middle is the best way to say it. I don't need to keep trying to add things to it. And so I think there can also be different needs even within the same mental illness or experience of different neurotypes based on Enneagram type. So like a 7 who's experiencing depression might need something really different than what I as a 4 need in depression, and there might be more common ground there than if that experience was not shared. But because of Enneagram type and the needs and the desires and the fears, even though we're both experiencing depression, we're going to need to be responded to differently. And so if you have both sets of tools, both sets of knowledge on board, can navigate that more effectively, I think, if that makes sense.
Can I jump in really quick?
Please do.
Okay. So that's the thing about the like meeting in the middle that's so problematic, I think, when it comes to autism and the neurodiversity paradigm, is that we ultimately need to do that to be healthy. We don't want to be living sort of on the shadow side of our understandings of these dimensions of ourselves. And yet where it gets so tricky is that in the autism community, for example, if you were a little kid and you went through ABA therapy, applied behavioral analysis, there's no meeting in the middle. You know, they're looking at a kid who's stimming or self-regulating and saying, stop flapping your hands now. It's not okay to do. And so that kid's being told that what comes natural in terms of regulation, emotionally, physically, and so forth, is simply wrong and bad. And so later on they resist and they say, well, no, I'm autistic. I'm not going to meet you in the middle at all. I'm just going to be myself. And so that gets really problematic and really troubling later. It's very, very hard to do that. And so you kind of see people who are more on the radical neurodiversity paradigm side of things. And I understand where they're coming from. It's tough.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an important and helpful point, Dan. Thanks.
Well, and I think that's another or an example of a reason why the own voices perspectives are so important here. Like we need to hear from autistic adults who have experienced that and why that's problematic, so that there can be a change in that medical model that hopefully we can be making some progress on. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think, just to talk about ABA for one more second, the idea that we're so far behind what you guys mentioned with Enneagram talk at the very outset, which is it's a tool for understanding motivations and going deeper into the reasons why things are the way that they are. Whereas, just to use the example of, a autistic person self-regulating or stimming, the idea is just to stop a behavior. And then it's only honestly in the last 10, 15 years that any medical professional said, well, wait a minute, why is that behavior occurring? Maybe we don't actually want to stop it. What's the deal? It actually seems to be helpful to that person and it's not hurting anyone. So that's the kind of usefulness of the neurodiversity paradigm, I think, that echoes what I hear from you with the Enneagram, to kind of get to the root of things, to the heart of things for self-awareness.
I love that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you all for sharing. This has been very insightful and very educational. And I'd like to thank both of our expert panelists who agreed to come up and share their time with us, and for everyone who's sent in questions, for everyone who's added to the discussion. Thank you to Professor Bowman for his additions at the end there. We are a little bit past 8 o'clock, and I know originally we said this was only going to be an hour-long event. So I'm going to open up this a little bit. If anyone has any big last-minute questions they want to sneak in, and if not, I'm just going to let the panelists share any parting thoughts they may have for us. So does anyone have a question they would like to ask? Okay.
Hi. I'm wondering if you can recommend any resources that might help with mistyping due to neurodifferences.
It's a very good question. Because there hasn't been enough work done on, I think, connecting the Enneagram and neurodiversity specifically, I don't know of any that are particularly tailored to that question. I think the best resources I know of, and Drew can add or correct to this, but just for mistyping in general are, again, and this is funny because this is really not the primary school that I've studied with, but again, the Enneagram Institute's website has a whole section of misidentifications and does a really thorough comparison and contrasting of each number. And so I think that's very helpful. There is a newer book by Ginger Lapid-Bogda, I believe is how you say her name. It's called The Art of Typing. It's very visually busy. It's a little stimulating if you're like me, but or it can be very visually engaging if
Yeah,
you're
it's
not
a
like
lot.
me.
It's a lot.
But the material is good. The resource is helpful. So that's what I would say.
Those would be the ones I recommend. I think Chris Hewitt's in the back of Sacred Enneagram has some pages devoted to mistyping as well. But I think your question raises the importance of this conversation, that there's a gap, a chasm, if you will, in the literature on this topic. So it seems like maybe Sarah and Dan need to write something on it, maybe.
Funny you should mention that. I was going to say to Sister Heather and to others too, the whole reason like that I met Sarah was, I think like my whole life revolves around Twitter. So I think it happened there. It was like I had just tweeted, okay, who's going to write the book on the relationship between the Enneagram and neurodiversity? Because I suddenly saw so many connections and I realized it's a fascinating topic and nobody had done anything about it. And then a day or two later, I think I got a message from you, Sarah, that was like, I could probably start something along those lines, and indeed had a lot of insight. And so we just started talking, but it's so underdeveloped right now and it's so important.
Yeah, I saw that tweet and was immediately like, oh my gosh, we need to do that. Would you collaborate? Then I was like, okay, calm down, like give yourself a few hours. And so I waited and then responded. But there are certainly, yes, conversations happening and work
Good.
that
I'm glad to hear that.
That we'll dive into. And I'm so glad to connect with this group. I mean, I just think like what a neat club to have, like what a neat organization to have on campus. Like if we had this when I was in college, like, oh my goodness. And so I hope that, you know, if and when we do dive into that maybe some of you would be willing to help us gather some of that data, because there is much work to be done, and clearly you're ahead of a lot of people on thinking about these things.
Yeah, and I'll just to echo really quickly, I in support of that statement that these guys are amazing, and I interviewed some of them for the book that I'm writing right now, and that's the best part of the book. So their insights are absolutely profound, and it has to do with some of these really fascinating intersections. So yeah.
Like for example, I mistyped as a 7 because I have ADHD, and 7s go to 5 in health, but I've since realized I'm now actually an 8 so I go to 5 in stress. So I used to go to 5, withdraw, and just turn into this like perseverating mess. And I would stay there for days and weeks thinking it was health. Mm-hmm. And now I know like this is a red flag and I'm able to get out of it much quicker. So wow, yes, please write that book. So important.
That's encouraging. Thank you. Yeah.
So if there are no other questions from anyone, I'd like to turn it over to the panelists for any final remarks, any engaging thoughts you had that didn't go into any of the questions? Anything very important you think we should all know about either Enneagram or neurodiversity? Just closing words of wisdom, I guess.
I'll let you go first, Drew.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would just continue to reiterate and highlight what's already been said, which I think is that this conversation needs to happen. I think this conversations around the Enneagram or around any sort of personality typing system can too easily be relegated to what might be considered, whatever, normative, right? Normative settings, and then privileged settings at that. So I do think that it's really important to push these conversations and continue to ask those questions that Dan asked on Twitter, to continue, Sister Heather, to ask the questions of where are the resources, because those need to exist. And so I'm just thankful, just to sit amongst you, even though virtually, with this conversation, because I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm thankful for it.
Well, I echo all of that for sure. And I'm struggling a little bit because I have so many other thoughts and questions I could ask you, or topics we could bring up, and maybe, and I hope we'll get a chance to expand the conversation at some point. But just in light of what's going on in the world and this situation we all find ourselves in, I just want to say, I'm a millennial. I'm in the millennial generation, and I am proud of our generation, despite all of the stereotypes that get applied. But I've been thinking a lot about how hopeful I am and impressed I am by your generation, and part of that has to do with this self-awareness, this value of difference, this willingness to talk about neurodiversity and to talk about mental health and to be open about all of this, and some of the layers of problematic stereotypes and just cultural conditioning that we've shed over the year. There's so much potential and just brilliance that I see in your generation, and so I love that you're gathering around these sorts of conversations, and I just want to encourage you to keep at it. I know it's crazy right now. Nobody's signed up to do school and clubs and everything over Zoom, or teach over Zoom, and so I hope that you can have what you need to keep going, because I think there's a lot of good work to be done that you're so equipped to do as we all go forward into hopefully a new sort of reimagined way of being together after all this. So I can't thank you enough for the invite and for listening and asking questions and just being here tonight. Thanks.
Thank you. This has been very encouraging and very educational. So once again, thank you to both of our wonderful panelists for showing up and sharing their time with us. And thank you to everyone else who showed up and interacted and asked questions and was here to listen and learn. This was really exciting. I'm glad that we were able to put this together via distance, even though we didn't get to do it in person. So with that, I believe that is all we have for tonight.
Yeah, just quick note, because I'm also Send. I'm the vice president. Just if you wanted to stay connected with us, we have an Instagram, taylorunivsend. You can email us, mentalhealthmatters.simha. Well, SMHA. That's the club name used to be Students for Mental Health Awareness, but we ended up changing it. We haven't had a chance to update the email yet. That's why the email's a bit weird. So yeah, just reach out to us if you want to stay connected more, if you want to learn more about who we are, why we exist, how we came to exist. Just let us know.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be with you all.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Have a great night.
Bye all.